Hello there, very good evening to you. You are joining us on a brand new edition of Vantage Point, and today we'll be highlighting about a number of topics, mainly the interim report that's being presented by the Constitutional Assembly that's ongoing, and also importantly enough, we need to be speaking or talking about the Bond Commission and the highlights of all the events that have taken place over the past week. And today, to talk about all of that, we've got Dr. Vantage with us in the studio. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me over on the program.
Well, Doctor, people may even think that we are boring them with the constitutional bill and the constitution. We've gotten nothing out of it because it's been going on for about a year or so, or even beyond. But can you tell us as to why this is important? Because we tend to, the topic keeps shifting from the president and how the executive powers are going to be devolved and how exactly the power structure is going to work. But if you can elaborate further as to what this would mean to an ordinary citizen of Sri Lanka.
Well, an ordinary citizen is probably going to think that the politicians have all gone nuts. Because when the 78 constitution was promulgated, Sri Lanka had an economic growth rate of 8%. And you can check that with the architect of that, and that's Mr. Ronnie DeMel, who's still in Colombo. In 72, when the first Republican Constitution was promulgated, the government was still very popular because it was the same year in which a very drastic land reform program was initiated.
Right.
So that was a very popular wave of reform. This government is not in that situation. It neither has a two-thirds majority of its own, i.e. it wasn't elected with a two-thirds majority. It's cobbled together, it's stitched together. And the two halves of the coalition disagreed with each other even yesterday when the debate on the interim report kicked off. The most important, the first day,
right.
You had a very strange lineup, Stephanie. You had the UNP, the TNA, and the JVP saying one thing. And that's strange, not only because they're ideologically diverse, which is all right, but because the UNP is in government and the JVP and TNA are in the opposition. But on the other side, you had not only the JO, which is the main anti-UNP opposition, but you also had the SLFP, which is a constituent member of the government, and the UNP sniping at each other. The UNP spent quite a bit of time dropping heavy hints at its own coalition partner, the SLFP.
Why exactly is it? Is it because the UNP is is more for the idea of removing powers from the president, and the SLFP not really sharing that type of ideology?
Well, you remember that fable about the stork and the fox. The stork invited the fox home for dinner and served dinner in a kind of a tall vase, a tall jar, which the stork could eat out of, but the fox could not.
But the stork and the fox in this scenario
are members of the same government.
Have already struck the deal. They wanted to be together. It was a marriage between...
Yeah, but they're not sure whether they should have kids and what kind of kids they should have. I mean, whether they both want to, you can't really fine-tune this, but there is a serious problem. The problem is this. There is no agreement on whether there should be a new constitution or changes to the existing constitution. There is no agreement on whether, in fact there is disagreement on whether the executive presidency should be abolished or whether it should be retained, perhaps with some further trimming. There is no agreement on whether the constitutional changes should be of a size that warrant a referendum, which is politically very risky, or whether it should stay this side of the boundary of a referendum.
But wasn't this the promise that was made before the presidential election of abolishing the executive presidency?
Well, there's no agreement on what was promised. Now, yesterday, I watched this on live television. I didn't accept a very generous invitation to attend because we had this taping today, but I watched it on live TV. And then I, of course, watched the newscasts.
Right.
And the SLFP's representative, Minister Nimal Siripala de Silva, who's one of the most senior people in Parliament, he actually fished out the manifesto of President Sirisena.
Right.
It's a big sheet, double spread, and he opened it and he read it out. And in that it's very clear. The President actually promised not, I repeat, not to undertake any constitutional reforms which would require a referendum. Now, what does that mean? That means no new constitution, because a new constitution requires a referendum. And no reforms which are mega, because those two require a referendum.
Right.
What you can do without a referendum is to have a moderate reform, which is what the President actually went to the country with.
Right.
And the person who translated, now he read it out in Sinhala, of course, the Sinhala original. The person who translated that into English is Professor Rajiv Vijayasinghe, who has in fact upheld that interpretation and said, I translated it into English, I know what was in Sinhala, and I know what I wrote in English, and the promise was not to undertake any constitutional reform that would require a referendum. So you immediately rule out touching what are known as the entrenched clauses of the Constitution, which require a referendum. Now, if you bring in a reform which the courts say, you impinged on or impacted on one of the entrenched clauses, that means you're immediately referred to a referendum. If you bring a new constitution, for sure you're referred to a referendum. Now, Nimal Siripala Silva in his speech said very clearly yesterday, in fact it was a warning to the UNP, it is, look, you have a referendum, it's not going to be on your new constitution, even if you have the best new constitution in the whole world. It's going to be on the economy, it's going to be on economic hardship, it's going to be on SITEM, it's going to be on everything in the kitchen sink, and that's what happens in other parts of the world. So, he said, this is the SLFP's stand, and these are the limits of the SLFP's position, meaning we are not willing to go beyond this. Now, there are two ways to go from here. I mean, these are two coalition partners.
Right.
Either you say, okay, if that's what you insist on, well, I mean, there are two of us in this. I can't prevail over you, so let's limit ourselves to what we have both agreed on. That is, we both agree that a change is needed. You say something new is needed. I say, no, let's repair the old. So, since I'm not going to agree that we should have a new one, it's too risky to go for a referendum. Let's, for now, maybe until the next election, let's just do the repairs of the house. If that's all we are agreed on. You want to flatten the place? I say no. I agree that there's a need for change, so what does it amount to? We renovate. So let's do the renovation. Now that's the smart way to do it. But what I saw on television yesterday on the live telecast was no flexibility. I saw the UNP, the TNA, and the JVP charging ahead,
Right.
and I saw the joint opposition saying no and pushing back, and the SLFP standing in the middle and waving its hands and saying, hey guys, let's just do only this much. So how are they going to resolve that?
Doctor, now that there are plans to have the local government body elections from next year, probably from January, do you think it's healthy for a governing party or governing parties to really show their weaknesses before an election, especially knowing that they are failing to garner support at a grassroots level? Well, we'll have the answers right after this short commercial break. Well, right before the break, I spoke to you and asked you about how exactly is the government planning on garnering support at a grassroots level, while they're openly, explicitly showing that they are not agreeing on something that is very important for the country, which is a constitutional amendment. How exactly are they planning on getting all the support that they need before the provincial council elections?
Well, Stephanie, there again, I don't think they have one view. I think the UNP thinks that it needs the votes of the minorities, and therefore it is going ahead with the call for a new constitution, irrespective of the dissent of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. So it all depends on your perception. Ideally, the two parties should go together, but the UNP thinks that, even if we cheese off the SLFP a bit, we are going to get the minority vote, and that's very important in Colombo. So we will go with the new constitution project, even if it means a hairline fracture or more. It's more than a hairline fracture, because it's obvious now in Parliament, a fissure in our coalition. Now, the SLFP, for its part, the SLFP is schizophrenic. Why? There's one side of the SLFP which says, hey, that's okay, let's fight with the UNP a bit in Parliament, because that will help us get votes, because our voters are anti-UNP. We have a huge competitor, Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother Basil's new outfit, what's known as the Pohotua party. So we've got to be seen to be anti-UNP. So let's fight a bit in Parliament on this issue, and it will actually help us. That's, I said, the SLFP is schizoid. That's one side of the SLFP. The other side of the SLFP is CBK. And she says, don't fight with UNP. Let's go along with them on this issue of the constitution. Then the other guys like Johnson says, hey, that will weaken us, we're going to lose. And her argument is, I don't care if we lose, I just want my party back. So that's what's going on there. It's a mess, right, Stephanie. The only way out is, possibly the only way out, is an interesting idea that President Sirisena came out with on the sharing a platform with Chandrika at the Sugatadasa Indoor Stadium the other day, addressing a rather large gathering of civil society activists, and we can talk about that as well.
Right. And what exactly now, we see the bill or the interim report being issued by the Constitutional Council. What sort of stance are they taking with regard to it? Do they believe, can they advise the Prime Minister and the President and the two parties about what sort of a stance they should be taking with regard to it?
No, right now everything is happening in the Constitutional Assembly, and the Constitutional Assembly is the Parliament. Now, Veeravansa's party is opted out, so they're out of that. Everybody else is in, and you have the three-day test match, the debate.
Right.
Much will depend on what happens at the end of the day, at the end of the debate. Now, it seems to me, having watched day one, that you have a more polarized situation than ever.
Right.
And it could lead to a deadlock. Now, President Sirisena seems to have anticipated that, and he's already introduced some new ideas, which is a good thing. At this meeting I was telling you about, President Sirisena said, let's face it, there is a problem which has to be resolved. He was talking about the North-South issue. Now, the UNP says, hey, that's not the only problem that has to be resolved. We've got to resolve your executive presidency as well, and we want it gone. But President Sirisena is saying, look, there is the issue. The issue is the ethnic issue. We need to solve that. And he says there's much being talked about that's inaccurate about this interim report. So he says, I'm going to try to bridge the gap. And he unveils 3 initiatives. He says, I intend to summon 3 conferences. It's very interesting. Firstly, I intend to summon a conference of all political parties represented in Parliament. Secondly, I intend to summon a conference of the leading clergy of all religions. Thirdly, I hope to summon a conference of academics, intellectuals, professionals. So, maybe he will be able to do what he did with the 19th Amendment. I wonder whether you remember the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was about the powers of the presidency.
Right.
Prime Minister Wickremesinghe produced a draft. When you read the draft, and we used to discuss it on this show previously with Mahina, the draft didn't look like it was trimming the powers of the presidency. The draft looked like it was shifting all the powers to him. So this draft was challenged in the courts. The Supreme Court looked at it and said, this won't do. These clauses have to go for a referendum. Otherwise, it's out, because this is something that's very serious you're trying here. It went back to Parliament. President Sirisena stepped in and he said, okay, this stuff that has to go for a referendum, dump it. Let's work with the rest. And he managed to get the support of everybody, including Vimal Veeravansh. Everyone except Rear Admiral Sarath Veerasekara, who voted against it. Of course, when the election came in August, the people of Ampara didn't vote for Rear Admiral Sarath Veerasekara. But he's the only one who voted against it. Everyone else supported the 19th Amendment. That successful discussion was spearheaded by President Sirisena. Now, I don't know whether he still has that magic, but he did it in the case of the 19th Amendment. I think he might be able to do it here.
Right. And just before the program started, we were talking about the Bond Commission. And it's important that we highlight it now that we are at least anticipating that it could be the end stages, but then there is an extension as well. And we are seeing so many highlights, so many stories that are coming out of the Commission. The first being as to why, even though the Prime Minister had openly expressed his willingness to come before the Commission, if ever he is summoned, to give a statement as to why the Prime Minister hasn't been summoned, being the Minister in charge of the central bank. And during at least 2 months ago, we saw the former Finance Minister Ravi Karanayake being summoned, even though he wasn't the minister in charge of the central bank at that time. And the question has arisen as to why the Prime Minister, who is also holding the position of keeping a lookout for the central bank, has not been summoned, even after he had expressed his willingness. Well, we'll definitely talk about it after this short commercial break. Welcome back. Well, you are watching Vantage Point, Dr. Dayathilaka. Why hasn't the Prime Minister been summoned to the Presidential Commission of Inquiry into the bond issuance?
I don't know. It's very strange, because let's look at what Donald Rumsfeld, quoting the Greeks, but few people know that, said were the known knowns. Rumsfeld said, there are the known knowns, there are the unknown knowns, there are the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. That is, there are things we know that we know. There are things we know that we don't know.
Right.
There are things we don't know that we know. Then there are things that we don't know that we don't know. Right? So, what do we know that we know? What are the known knowns? The known knowns are: the Prime Minister removed the central bank from where it normally is, under the Finance Minister, and brought it under himself.
Right.
Then we know that the Prime Minister reached out to Mr. Arjuna Mahendran, who was in Singapore,
right,
and is not a citizen of Sri Lanka, and invited him or persuaded him to come in as the head of the central bank, which he had previously moved under his command. Then we know that Mr. Arjuna Mahendran has a young relative called Mr. Arjuna Aloysius. Then we know that Mr. Arjuna Mahendran and Mr. Arjuna Aloysius sometimes share the same roof. And then we know that Mr. Mahendran made certain decisions which other senior members of the central bank staff say were unique. And we know that PTL, headed by Mr. Mahendran's son-in-law, nephew, whatever, made quite a lot of money. Now these are all known knowns, and on the surface of it, or on the face of it, as they say in courts, there's plenty of reason to bring the Prime Minister in and have a chat with him for the public record. Now that's not happened. So we are falling far short of the standards, say, of a US senatorial or congressional hearing, or even a special prosecutor. I don't know why it's not happened, because there's every reason for him to come and face questions. Sending him a questionnaire, we don't know what was in the questionnaire, we don't know what his replies are. We hope all of that will be in the public domain, but unfortunately it's not like the trail has gone cold, but the investigation seems to have stopped at the water's edge.
Right. And also the Spanish issue of the referendum. And now the Spanish government has openly said, yes, Puigdemont can in fact run for the election, but they're waiting for the court orders as to whether he'll be prosecuted in the future is something that we will have to find out in the future. So what sort of connection what sort of parallels can you draw between a referendum in Spain and an anticipation of another referendum in Sri Lanka in the Constitutional Council?
Well, I love Barcelona. It's one of my favorite cities in the world, and I was fortunate enough when I was Sri Lanka's ambassador to France also to be accredited to Spain and Portugal, and I spent time more than once in Catalonia, and I have a sense of the place. Now, it's a very serious situation, because this can trigger numerous other calls for independence via referenda in various other parts of Europe, and Europe is afraid of that, because you could have a rash breaking out.
Right.
You could have a renewal of the Scottish situation, and President Putin has pointed out, excuse me guys, shouldn't you have thought about all of this when all of you were very happy to dismember Yugoslavia and recognize the various breakaway republics when we said you shouldn't, such as Bosnia, Kosovo, and so on and so forth.
Right.
But it started with former Yugoslavia, and now it's coming home right into the heart not only of the EU but NATO, because Spain is an important member of NATO. It's a serious political crisis.
Right.
There's a third position between that of the Madrid government and that of the secessionists in Catalonia, and that's the left position of Podemos, which is that there should be a federation,
right,
rather than a secession. But right now nobody's interested in the third position, and you have a polarization. Now, what is the relevance for Sri Lanka? 2 points. One, remember, Spain does not have an executive president. Britain doesn't have an executive president.
Right.
In fact, it will be very difficult, if you spin the globe, to point out to me a country which had an elected executive president and a unitary system which had a successful separation of a part of it. It doesn't happen.
Right.
But if you don't have a unitary system and an executive president, so we have both, it's easier to separate. So at least it's easier to have a referendum on separation, such as Iraqi Kurdistan. There's no president. It's a federal republic with a prime minister. Britain, it's a unitary state nominally, but with a prime minister, not a president. When you have a president and a unitary state, it's very difficult to do. So one wonders why on earth Sri Lanka should contemplate dismantling the executive presidency and perforating the unitary framework, when all around you in the world you see these things, these secessionist movements popping up, not violently,
Right.
but
do you
using
think-
democracy.
But do you think this time around the Spain problem has really escalated? Because we've seen this happening before.
But it's gone beyond it. The recent referenda in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Catalonia have given a 90% vote for separation. Unlike in Scotland where it stopped
Right.
just below that. But it can happen again. The two previous referenda were Quebec and Scotland, and those stopped this side of it. But it can be rekindled because of the new wave of peaceful secessionism through referenda. In Iraqi Kurdistan, it has stopped there. There's a crisis. It has stopped for a very simple reason. The Iraqi army went in and took part of it. And the Turkish army has warned that they would do the rest. But you can't do that in Europe.
So it just boils down to no proper authority being in control of it.
It boils down to not having the right kind of system. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be autonomy. There has to be autonomy. But autonomy must be of a sort where you cannot have a referendum and decide that you're going to walk away.
Right. And the scare is if autonomy turns into autocratic system.
Well, the scare is twofold. One is, what if you give too little autonomy, then people will want to leave. But if you give too much, then they'll be tempted to leave.
So finding the balance is always
is always tricky. The other scare in Sri Lanka is this, that if you have a new constitution or a constitution that moves in the direction of federalism, it will be sent down for referendum.
Right.
And what will happen is that the southern two-thirds of the country, most of the island, will vote against it. Most countries in the world today vote against the government at referenda. But the north and the east, or the north and part of the east, will vote for. And that would be already the equivalent of the Catalan referendum.
Right.
So that is the fear in the Sri Lankan parliament these days over the debate on the constitution.
Thank you, Dr. Dayan Jayatillake. It was, in fact, a very interesting discussion, I must say. Well, you can join in on this discussion by sending us your questions, your views to newsfirst@maharaja.lk. This place is always open and we will make sure that we feature them on the program. So until we meet next fortnight, this is Vantage Point. This is Stephanie Lazarus signing off.